Joining us now for his 5th consecutive and sadly final appearance here on the agenda all week, Jeremy Rifkin from the Foundation on Economic Trends. He is the author of 17 books. Most recently, The Empathic Civilization. He comes to us from the Wharton School of Business, University of Pennsylvania. And we are going to finish up the week, Jeremy Rifkin, talking about the empathic civilization and why this notion of us as a kind of predatory, aggressive, overly ambitious, acquisitive people, you believe, is just wrong, and that we're actually way more empathic than we give ourselves credit for. Make the case, if you would.
It's dead wrong, the Enlightenment idea that we're autonomous, materialistic, utilitarian, predatory, competitive, libido-driven. If that were the case, we're probably doomed. I mean, how does a human race...
Well, maybe we are.
Well, we may be. How does a human race come together if that's our nature? Now, so what I'd ask every parent that's listening is that when that little baby comes out of the womb, parents, do you see a little depraved soul there that's competitive, predatory, materialistic, utilitarian,
no, we
libido?
teach them how to do that.
Right. Let me take you back to Parma, Italy, a little laboratory in the 1990s. They got a macaque monkey in a lab, and they have an MRI machine on the monkey. Monkey's opening up a nut, the neurons light up. By sheer serendipity, and this is how scientific breakthroughs happen, right afterwards, a guy walks into the lab, a human being, by accident, looks at the nuts, he's hungry, and he tries to open up a nut and eat it. The macaque stares at him. And then they notice the MRI machine, the same neurons light up in the macaque when he's observing a human open up the nut as when he was trying to open up the nut himself. They thought the MRI broke. What they discovered was mirror neurons. We now realize that many primates, elephants, some other creatures, maybe many more than we think, are actually soft-wired with these neurons. They call them the empathy neurons that allow us to actually feel another person as if we are feeling themselves. So if a spider goes up your arm, I think, woo. Or if you puncture yourself and bleed, I'll wince, correct? We take that for granted, but alligators don't do that. Mammals that nurse their young have these empathic distress signals so they can actually feel another person, another being's plight as if they were feeling it. Your dog can do that. Your companion animal can do that. So I'll give you a couple examples of experiments that there are hundreds of these that have been done that show that our babies are not born to be competitive and predatory. They're born to be empathic and social. And if those attachment behaviors are not met with bad parenting or physical abuse or neglect, then the secondary drives come in, the predatory, narcissistic drives. I'll give you a couple experiments. These are wild. In one experiment, they have little 10-month-old babies on the floor, all right, pre-verbal, not even walking. And they have a little plane of wood that goes up like this, and a little glued piece of wood with 2 eyes, and it's trying to get up the plane and falls down each time. Second experiment, they have another piece of wood with 2 glued eyes helping the first one up, and they get up. The third one, the bad guy, a piece of wood with 2 glued eyes. Every time the first piece of wood tries to get up to the plane, the third one knocks him down. Then they let the babies loose. All the babies scamper up to the helper piece of wood. None of them will go near the hinderer. How do they know to do this? Second experiment.
Instinctive, you're saying.
Max Planck Institute, Germany. An adult, they got all these little babies sitting in there. They're not even walking yet, no identity, self-identity. And the first experiment, the guy is taking clothes off a clothesline, and they accidentally fall as he's trying to collect them. The second experiment, he throws them to the ground. Second set of experiments, he's trying to collect books, and they accidentally fall. The next time, he throws them on the ground. If the clothes are thrown on the ground or the books are thrown on the ground, the babies don't move. If he's trying to collect the clothes and they fall or the books fall, they all scamper up to help him.
Isn't that fascinating?
How do they? And there are thousands of these experiments now in the last 10 years.
So we're hardwired for empathy.
We are soft-wired for it, and then if it gets hardwired through proper parenting, schooling, culture, or it gets repressed, and then the drives we think we have, those are secondary drives. The problem is those secondary drives we took as primary, predatory, utilitarian, materialistic, and then we embedded them in our parenting styles, our schools, our governance, and our business, and we became what we thought we were. But the reason we know this isn't right, how happy are we based on that concept of human nature? We didn't need the scientists to tell us this. When we're 65 or 70 and look back in life, the big moments that counted were the moments when I said, I felt like an island to myself. I remember that moment. My libido was extinguished. That was great. Or I really enjoyed that utilitarian deal where I accumulated a little bit more wealth. Forget it. The moments we look back on are the moments where we transcended ourselves, where we could actually experience another's plight as if it were our own. Empathy is very complex. It's the way we think. It's feelings and abstract thinking. So if I empathize with you, it has the width of death and the celebration of life. If you've ever empathized with your children or your spouse, it's the feeling that they have a one and only life like I do, that they're vulnerable and imperfect, and their life is tricky, and it's tough being alive, whether you're a fox in the wood or a human. And when we see and feel another person's struggle to flourish and be, we're with them. We want to celebrate their life. We want to help them with compassion because we're there too.
Let me get you to tell the story that you tell in the book, which I'd never heard before. The ones you just gave, the examples are fairly recent, but go back to World War I and the Germans and who are, you know, literally feet away, dozens of feet away from each other.
That's extraordinary. That's the beginning of the Empathic Civilization, the beginning of the book, because it hit me so vividly. They were 5 months into World War I. They were in the Argonne. They were, both sides were in trenches, and they were just mass slaughter in these trenches across the landscape. And men were standing up sleeping. There were vermin. They were in their own feces. It was terrible. And their dead comrades were sitting there in no man's land. They couldn't even get them and bring them back for burial.
Thousands of bodies everywhere.
Thousands. Mm-hmm. All of a sudden, it was Christmas Eve, and the German High Command had sent little Christmas trees to their men, and they started lighting them up. It was like a stage set. All of a sudden, across the German front, you saw these little Christmas trees lighting up. And then the Allies heard Silent Night being sung by the Germans. And then they started singing other Christmas carols. And then our troops, the British troops, the Allies started applauding and singing Christmas carols back to the Germans. And then all of a sudden, a couple of guys on both sides get out of the trenches and start walking toward each other. Then hundreds get out of the trenches. Then thousands get out of the trenches. And they share photos. They have cigarettes. They start playing soccer.
This really happened?
This happened. 100,000 men. It broke down the whole chain of command. So here's the idea, the old idea of human nature: competitive, predatory, authoritarian, materialistic, totally broke down. They overcame all of those ideas, and they walked toward each other's humanity. They empathically embraced each other because what they experienced at that moment is each other's vulnerability, that each of them had a one and only life, they had a family, that each of them was struggling to flourish and be, and this is only one opportunity on this life, and they embraced each other.
How long did that last?
It lasted 24 hours until the central command on both sides heard about it, and they went ballistic. They said, this is going to break down the entire military chain of command, and some were punished and were taken to task.
Can you imagine a day and age when we become such an empathic civilization that we just can't kill each other in wars like that anymore?
I can imagine that for sure. Let me say that the reason we have such a bad idea about the human race, and not to cast aspersion to our historians, but if you take a look, if you're a student of history books, they're terrible. They're all about war, conquest, exploitation, empires, redress of grievances. Now, why is that what we talk about in history books?
Because it's dramatic and it sells books.
Well, absolutely. And it's extraordinary because these events, genocide, blowbacks, exploitation, they're extraordinary. They don't happen every moment. So they get our attention. They trigger flight, fright. And then they become newsworthy. We do this on TV. But then we chronicle them as if this is our history uninterrupted. And it gives us a pretty bad picture of the history of the human race. We would have probably perished a long time ago if that was our nature. I remember a quote by George Frederick Hegel. I read it 30, 40 years ago. And he said, happiness are the blank pages of history. They're the periods of harmony. And what he was suggesting is there's another history. The Empathic Civilization, this book I wrote, I went back and tried to rethink history from a completely different interpretation. What we find, there is another history. It seems ordinary, and we don't talk about it, but there's a history of the evolution of empathy of the human race. It's there, it's incontrovertible. I couldn't use historians to tell the story, so I went back and I looked at narrative. From the first written story at Gilgamesh, through the great Greek tragedies, the romances, the novel in the modern age.
You think it goes back that far?
Oh, absolutely. And what you find is if you're in a primitive forager-hunter society, There's empathic distress, but not mature empathy, because there's no sense of selfhood. There's no sense of I'm an I and you're a you. It's a collective we. So empathy extends to blood ties, and it's mainly empathic distress, but it isn't mature empathy. When you go to the great hydraulic agricultural civilizations and create theological consciousness, all the great religions form. What happens? Empathy extends from blood ties to a new fiction, religious families. So now every Jew thinks of every other Jew as family. It's fictional, not blood, and they empathize. Every Christian empathizes with their brother and sister Christians, Muslims with Muslims. By the time you get to the Industrial Revolution, with the market economy and nation state, you have this new fiction, national governments. All of a sudden, Germans think of other Germans as Germans. It's a fiction. They empathize with Germans, but maybe not Italians. Italians think of Italians as family and empathize, but maybe not with the French. But again, empathy extends one more time from blood ties to religious ties, now to national identity. So the question I'm asking in the book, why isn't it possible now that we extend the boundaries from blood ties, religious ties, and national ties, and start thinking of the human race as a family, start thinking as the biosphere as our community, our fellow creatures as our evolutionary family? Why is that a big stretch? Why would we only stop with tribal blood ties, religious association, and national identity?
Who's doing that? Who's thinking that way?
Well, I think Homo empathicus is emerging across the sciences. I think the European Union is a little ahead of the game, because it's the first, and reason is so much bloodshed in that continent. That's the bloodiest continent in the world. And after thousands of years, and after World War II and the Holocaust, they said, we're done. We're taking the blood, we're taking it off our hands. We're going to learn how to live together.
You still had the Balkans in the 90s. And
you still did. It was the last remnants. But now there are 500 million people across 27 states that were at war for thousands of years, living in peace, open borders.
Financially in trouble, but...
Well, so the whole world's financially in trouble. I remind our friends that the EU is still the lead economy in the world, and the GDP of their 27 states exceeds the GDP of my 50 states, and if you put China and the US together, it's almost matched by the entire wealth of the EU. It's just they're not a military power. But the European Union, among the younger generation, the sensibility is that we build bridges of peace. They don't have a big military machine. We learn how to extend our cultural diversity so we think as a family. There are a lot of problems. There's a lot of xenophobia and throwback, but at least in principle, they're there. They believe in not just growth, but sustainable development. They champion the climate change treaty.
So they're the model, you think?
I think they are. I think what we're going to start to see as we move to a third industrial revolution, where we share energy across entire continents, we're going to see continental political frames of reference. They're going to be networks, not hierarchies. So we'll have the localities, the regions, the nations, and then because these energies have to be distributed across continents, we're going to see the world boil down to 5 continental unions: the African Union, the Asian Union, European Union, the American unions. And we will begin to create, I hope, biosphere consciousness. I hope we can do it in time.
In our last minute, tell me whether you really believe your fellow Americans can rethink of the world in those kinds of terms, because we've certainly not, those of us who have a front row seat on what the American experiment is probably don't think you're capable of it.
Well, if we think of our fellow Americans as Canadians, yes. No, I'm serious, because I think the Canadian sensibility is much closer to continental Europe. The British sensibility is much closer to the U.S., which is old-fashioned. Canadians tend to think more in terms of a quality of life, a society in which social capital is essential to the good life. That's continental European vision, too. So I would say I have hope for the United States, but I don't think it's the laboratory. I think the EU is a laboratory. I think Canada is a laboratory. And I think the U.S. and China and other places will have to catch up. Can we reach Homo empathicus in time? Can we create a third industrial revolution that gets us to a post-carbon era? Can we rethink the way we educate each generation so we think biosphere consciousness and not geopolitics? Big, daunting mission, but if we don't do that, what's plan B? How do we save our species? How do we learn to live together in a common planet if we don't develop biosphere consciousness and think as a human species with our fellow creatures on one Earth? I don't think there's a plan B. We have no choice.
I can't thank you enough for spending so much time with us here at TVO. Jeremy Rifkin from the Foundation on Economic Trends, his newest book, The Empathic Civilization. So good of you to join us, Jeremy. Thanks so much.
Pleasure.